Welcome to this ACFID CSIRO learning event. It is an absolute pleasure to have you all joining us today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waters of all the different places we're all joining from today. I'm on Ngunnawal country and I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to acknowledge that this land was and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. On behalf of today's facilitation team, I am delighted to welcome you to this learning event, which is the first in a series brought to you by ACFID and CSIRO. Some of you have been receiving updates about this particular collaboration. I think some people here today were part of the group that caught up back in February, which now feels like a very long time ago. Our world has changed quite a bit since then. But we are stoked to be bringing you this series on designing development programs for rapid climate and global change. And we do really hope to see you during the rest of this learning event series and beyond. I'm also going to put in a cheeky plug for the community of practice as well. If you are not already a member of that COP, I really do encourage you to consider joining the COP. It is a fantastic group.
So we're running a project funded and supported by the Australia Pacific Climate Partnership called Knowledge Brokering for Pacific Climate Futures, and we've engaged with ACFID to try and reach out to you and the membership about this project, and perhaps to see to what extent it would be useful for you, and how we can perhaps support you with your thinking and practice. Just like to introduce the team. Some but not all are on the call today, and we have some extra help as well. So there's myself, James, Shona Mihag, who you'll hear from in a second, Nikki Grigg, who's not on the call, nor Emily Barber, but Michaela Kassane is. And then we're supported by Hannah Barrowman as well, who you'll meet in a minute, from the Australia Pacific Climate Partnership Support Unit, and also Katie Frisch, who very, very kindly has come and helped us because there was so much interest from you. And she's also from the Australia Pacific Climate Partnership Support Unit. And of course, Jess and Kate, who are holding our hand and helping us as well. So the challenge that we've been asked to look at is that future climate and disaster risk to Pacific development, and therefore the achievement of the SDGs, is growing. We all know climate change is coming. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. And in fact, you could quite honestly say it's already hitting many places, depending on where you go around the region in different ways. In 2017, the Australia Pacific Climate Partnership, I call them APCAP from now on, did a survey, and I think Paul Mitchell might be on the line as well from Red Cross, and I think he was involved in this. They did a survey across the Pacific to try and understand why and how climate information and climate data was being used and applied in decision making. And two of the key messages that came out of that survey was that tailored tools and processes are necessary that can mainstream climate disaster and other future risks into development decision making, because at the moment there's a wealth of information, but it's just not being integrated. So we need to work much harder on how that is done. And at the same time, the other lesson that came out was that there needs to be much more capacity for knowledge brokering amongst government, NGOs and communities to try and translate that information into decision making in an appropriate manner for whatever context people are involved in. And so that really was the starting point for this project. So in 2019 to 2021, and hopefully beyond, depending on what happens obviously with COVID and so on, what we're trying to do with our project is build capacity for climate resilient development decision making amongst NGOs, agribusiness and tourism, excuse me, with a focus primarily on PNG and the Solomon Islands to start with. And then we hope that the tools and processes that we'll develop through a set of case studies there will be scaled up and out through the APCAP network. And to do that, we want to establish a network of knowledge brokers and champions within these sectors and within those two countries at least, with a particular focus on women and people with disability. So we're really seeking ultimately to try and build knowledge brokers across the region, across projects, across programs, and help develop processes and tools that they can use that are appropriate for them in order to become brokers in their organizations and even in their communities. And hence mainstream future risk and climate change and other risk into decision making. But then, of course, our little friend arrived, and that's turned everyone's world pretty much upside down. And we've had to begin to refocus a bit what we're doing and how we're doing it, and hence these events as well, which we, as I said originally, we wanted to carry out face to face, having had some experience with our case studies in PNG and the Solomons, but progress has been stalled. So we decided to go ahead with these events anyway and see if we could build up a bit of momentum while we're all hoping and waiting for the first, second, third, fourth waves to pass. But it's worth saying as well that in many ways, this little beast has in some ways raised all of our awareness of just how real these shocks and spikes can be. And as we'll show you in a minute with some results from a survey we did with our case studies, I think we all tend to be fairly positive and optimistic about the future and probably downplay risk. I think most of us do that. I think it's just human nature. But a lot of us, I think, knew that this could happen, but didn't really think it would. And we sort of put it behind us, and what's out of sight is out of mind. But here it is. So in many ways, I think COVID provides us with an opportunity to really focus our thinking about future uncertainty, not just pandemics, but other things that we think might happen, but now COVID clearly tells us really could happen. So I think we can use this as an opportunity to really sharpen our focus and our thinking about how we deal with the future and how we design development to be effective amongst this kind of uncertainty and potential shocks. So the project that we're running basically focuses on development projects, programs, and we're talking about projects, if you like, as pizzas. The pizzas being the pieces of a project that, when they put them together, basically determine the perception of the problem that you're trying to deal with, and therefore the project design and its implementation. And those pieces of the pizza generally that determine that outcome are the rules that you operate to. That could be funding rules, your own institutional rules, the goals of your organization, the politics of your organization, but also the politics with other organizations, your funders, other competing organizations, your networks, both internally and externally, your capacities in terms of your skills and what you're capable of doing and where your skills lie. And also, of course, the information that you have to hand that you can apply to frame your problem and your solution. And in amongst the project, you have stakeholders, partners, staff members that make up that network of people that ultimately form the bits of the pizza. And so what we've done with this project in the first phase, and this was really finished in about February, January this year, we engaged with a suite of potential case studies in the Solomons and PNG, directed by DFAT, who are supporting these programs. We as CSIRO were sort of engaging as knowledge brokers. That's these orange figures. Our first step was to try and understand what the needs of the development programs were in terms of understanding future risks, climate change, disasters, and so on, and the barriers to them being able to access information and apply that information in their project design and implementation. And really, because of COVID, we've done that, and then we've sort of stalled a bit. We've tried to go ahead a little bit further than that, as you'll see, but unfortunately, progress has been definitely delayed a little bit because we can't really get into the activities that we'd planned fully. But that next phase that we were hoping to start, and we're just scratching the surface with at the moment, is that we would then bring, excuse me, we would then bring the information that our case study said that they needed and they were lacking, and then we would engage as knowledge brokers in each of those projects to try and co-produce tools and processes that would help those individual programs or projects integrate that information into their decision making and the way that they frame their problem and how they implement their solution. And in doing so, we want to integrate our information and knowledge with their information and knowledge in a process of what's called knowledge co-production. And if you look in the key at the bottom there with the sort of the DNA helix or double helix, what we're trying to do is get from information to knowledge. So that process of actually applying information and then through applying it, turning it into knowledge. And in doing that, we hope that within each project and program, some people will emerge as knowledge brokers who want to have their skills enhanced in this area and want to learn how to use these tools and processes themselves so that they can then go and apply those ideas in their own organization and perhaps elsewhere as well. And then in the third phase, we are hoping to help those case study projects and programs redesign their thinking and their problem identification and solutions, and also train up the knowledge brokers that emerge in those skills. And in doing so, we hope that we'll definitely enhance their knowledge, so going from information to knowledge, and their capacities and their skills, and possibly their networks as well by linking within the organization, but also outside the organization. And then maybe we'll influence politics and change the goals and the rules possibly of the organization as well, because some of the thinking that we do with the organizations will reframe the way that they operate potentially. And then we hope that their problem will be reframed possibly, and the project even might be redesigned with this new knowledge about future risks. And then there'll be a certain degree of learning and iterative improvement of those tools and processes. And then we'd like to link up the knowledge brokers through their training with a broader community of practice through the Australia Pacific Climate Partnership to help them support each other across programs and projects that they might be running elsewhere. So that was the idea. As I said, we're kind of stalled, or not stalled, but certainly the brakes have been put on us between phase 1 and phase 2. So we're just starting phase 2 really, and engaging with our case studies and bringing information to the table, but without face-to-face learning opportunities, workshops and so on, it's very difficult to do the co-production. We're doing the best we can, but it's very difficult, especially in country with obviously people in PNG and the Solomons. So, excuse me, sorry about this, I'll stop in a minute. So one of the tools that we're trying to develop as an overarching sort of framework for our work is when we engage with these case studies and programs, we want to help them try and think about how they see their problem and how they design their solution relative to that problem. And to do this, we've applied what's called the Cynefin framework, and some of you may be already familiar with this, which was designed by David Snowden back in the 2000s, really to support businesses and corporations think about how they deal with problems and respond to them through decision-making and leadership. We've sort of adapted this to the issue of development projects and designing development projects. He talks about 4 sort of problem domains, and the sorts of characteristics of the problems that sit in those domains, and then the solutions that you probably need to have to tackle that particular kind of problem. The first domain is the simple domain, where problems are usually where you can see cause and effect relationships quite clearly, and they're repeatable and predictable. And it's a known problem, possibly something that you've seen before. And the kinds of design that you might use for your solutions in that case would be standard operating procedures, best practice guidelines, that kind of thing. So engineers building a bridge which has to be a certain width and withstand a certain amount of flow through the river below, you know, that's a fairly standard engineering design that you would use to solve that particular problem. The next domain is complicated, and this is where the relationships between cause and effect are understandable, but possibly not direct. They may be separated by time and space, and so they're knowable problems, but just not quite as easy as the simple ones. And in that case, you'd probably use expert knowledge to design your solution, and good practice, because there may be lessons learned from previous examples that you could apply, but maybe there's a little bit more flexibility needed. The third one is complex, and these problems have indirect cause and effect, and they're really only understandable in retrospect and probably not repeatable, so you don't see the same thing occurring over time in other places. And in this case, you're talking about the sort of the known unknowns. In other words, you have a fair idea what might be happening, but there's you're also aware that there's stuff that you don't know and you don't understand about the problem. And the solution design for this is experiments and probing, using multiple kinds of knowledge and options to tackle the problem, and emergent practice, because you don't know initially what's actually going to work and what's not going to work. The fourth is chaotic, and this is where the problem identification is hard, because there's no cause and effect relationships that are immediately perceivable. And this is really the unknown unknowns, thinking of Donald Rumsfeld's famous speech. And the solutions in this space tend to be stability-focused interventions, just keeping a lid on everything, crisis management, and novel practice. And it's quite interesting thinking about COVID at the moment and how people are responding to COVID as a problem. It seems to oscillate between chaos and complex and then simple. And as people sort of get a grasp of what the virus is doing, and then they suddenly realize they don't know what the virus is doing. So the problem is sort of rehashed each time, and every country seems to be dealing with it slightly differently. So that's the framework. And then just to say, there's a final fifth one around disorder, where there is no way of actually perceiving what's going on, but maybe just put that to one side for now. So what we asked you to do was to see whether or not this framework was useful for your projects that you're running or planning. And we sent you some homework, as Jess said earlier, and just to see whether or not it was easy for you to apply this framework in your thinking. And these were the homework questions that we asked you to think about. What's the development problem that your project or program is seeking to solve? Does your problem consider future uncertainty from climate change, natural disaster, other shocks, or pandemics, obviously now? And then using the framework, in which domain does your problem lie in? What, you know, how do you see your problem? And then also from that framework, in which domain do you think your solution sits in? And what we're really interested then is the fifth question is, were there any mismatches between the way that you're framing your problem and the way that you're framing your solution? Because in that case, we'd like to know why. You know, is it because you can't deal with the big picture, you just have to deal with a small chunk that you're capable of dealing with? Or is it you don't have the capacities or the funding to deal with a big problem, so you have to boil it down to a small solution? That's what we'd be really interested to know. And then ultimately, as we'll go forward and you'll hear later, we'd like to go further and explore what sort of capacities and skills you might need, and knowledge brokering ultimately, to deal with some of those mismatches. So I'm now going to hand over to Shona, who is going to talk about the survey that we did with our case studies to try and look at their perspectives on some of these questions, just to give you a bit of a taster of what's going on out there in PNG and the Solomons anyway. So Shona, over to you.
Thanks, James. So next slide, please. So as James said, these were a set of responses from 8 case study partners in Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. I'm only going to give you a smattering of our sort of context or baseline analysis, but one of them that we found interesting was how risky are climate hazards. And you'll see actually for the most part, except for fire, and you probably answer that differently being in Australia, that most things in the climate hazards were somewhat to extremely risky for most of the participants. Some of the other hazards that we asked about, next slide, James, included things like population growth, epidemics, political instability. Now, noting that most people thought these were somewhat risky, this was actually prior to the COVID that we actually undertook this survey. So I would be very interested to see if these sorts of risks changed. Next slide, please, James. So James just went through the Cynefin framework and how it applies. So when we talked to our 8 case study partners, we asked them to answer a set of questionnaires as well as undertake an interview. In response to some of the questionnaires about the type of problems that they're trying to address, a lot of the case studies actually defined quite a narrow, clear vision. They felt a high degree of control in their projects. They felt that they considered risks to these projects, and that although they did note across the project that they had a very differing ability to respond to these risks. Now, when we delved down through the interviews, we found that people had some fairly nuanced understandings about the complex challenges in the problem space that they were dealing with, but this didn't actually translate into sort of the complex projects. And so when we started to unpack this, it became clear that people were choosing projects that they felt were achievable, so implementable and fundable. So this was leading to a very simple and complicated framing of their projects. And when we delved a little bit more into the risks, we found that the risks that people were considering for the project were things around health and safety, around infrastructure, around things that they could actually control within the project, rather than addressing or planning for that broader set of environmental risks or the socioeconomic risks that we highlighted earlier, even though they were noted as being very important and potentially quite risky. So then we moved on and we actually asked them how they were actually designing their projects. And we aligned these questionnaires and interview responses to the Cynefin framework that you see here. So this narrative of what was fundable and implementable carried through to this funding. We found that a majority of people designed their projects or approaches here, the first column, that they could do things that were adapting existing practice, tailoring it to their current context, sometimes in conjunction with local stakeholders. The second column, which is how the information was used, tended to be slightly more diverse across the projects, describing a mix of specialists coming together to try and find out solutions, very occasionally with non-specialists coming in to help create a new type of knowledge. And then for the last one, what information is used, we found that multiple sources of technical knowledge were used, with project teams also describing their challenges at accessing and using this technical information. What this means is that while the project teams realised that they're in a far more complex and potentially in some cases chaotic environment, they actually really designed their projects to be simple or at best complicated in a response to funding and implementable requirements. So while the framing was quite narrow, we found that some of the responses that people included in their design was actually quite complex in the terms of the approaches that they used, which for us means that they actually do have the skills and competencies, but they currently feel they can't tackle these bigger risks. So that's just a little snapshot, James.
Thanks, Shona. Thanks, and thanks everyone for listening.